guys, my name's Candice Conroy. I am a licensed mental health counselor in Orlando, Florida. So this is another video, part of a series on coping with the feelings that are coming up around COVID-19. So it's my hope to keep putting these videos out and to spread the word about some of the emotional impacts that we are likely to see coming up with this crisis. And just start talking about some of the ways that we can start to manage those feelings. I realize that people who are not in the therapy world or have never been to therapy themselves may find themselves at an incredible emotional disadvantage right now in terms of understanding what you're feeling and understanding how to manage that. So my hope is just to put information out there for whoever needs it. So today's video is about validating primary emotions. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is. Basically, we're all born with emotions, and there are certain emotions that are supposed to come up in certain situations as useful signals of information to us, right? So an example that I use all the time in my sessions is if you imagine that you are standing on a crosswalk and there is a car coming. Your inborn, wired-in emotional response should be fear in that moment. And that fear is going to give you the urge to jump out of the way, right? It's going to give you an impulse. It's also going to give you a physical sense, right, of fear. And it's going to give you thoughts. Oh no, this car is coming. It's coming quickly, right? So emotions are, if we really simplify it down to the most basic, they are information signals that help us interact with our environment and with the situations that come up. And one of the important things to know about emotions is that they come quicker than thoughts usually. They are rapid fire, they are subconscious. You don't necessarily have to be thinking a thing to have a feeling about it, because our body needs to be able to respond before we have time to think about things sometimes, right? So if you were standing on that crosswalk, for example, you don't want to be standing there thinking about, well, how fast is he driving? I mean, what is the likelihood that this person slows down? All of these questions, you don't have time for that, right? And your body recognizes that in a lot of situations. So our emotions happen really quickly and a lot of times outside of our awareness, unless you have intentionally been practicing emotional awareness. So, key point to know is just that they are signals of information. You need the information in order to interact with your environment and to take helpful action in a lot of situations. So, with COVID, with the current crisis we've got going on, there are a lot of natural emotions coming up that are important for us to be feeling right now, right? Anxiety and uncertainty is a very crucial emotion for us to be feeling right now. I did a video on that a couple days ago, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of questions right now, some of which we can answer, right? So questions about how much do I need to get at the grocery store? Things like how long will our finances last if I am out of work next week, right? These are all questions that we can answer, right? So the feeling of uncertainty that gives us that impulse to seek out information is a really useful feeling, even though it's super uncomfortable. Nobody wants to feel it, but it gives us useful urges. Some other emotions that you'll probably notice coming up around COVID, depends on the person, right? There's no right or wrong, but some other ones that I'm generally expecting people will be feeling is there will be a fair amount of overwhelm, because overwhelm is our too much emotion. So there is too much right now. There's too much change. There's too much information bombarding us. We're losing too many things at one time from our sense of normalcy. It's just a lot, right? There's a lot to take in, and so you're going to feel overwhelmed, most likely. Another thing that I'm anticipating a lot of people are going to be feeling is loss. So loss in ways that may relate to loss of a loved one, but on a much more general scale, relate to losses of normalcy, loss of routine, loss of plans or trips that you had, celebrations that you were looking forward to. So a fair amount of loss and sadness and disappointment around there. Another big one that I'm anticipating a lot of people feeling is guilt and empathy and helplessness, kind of like a cluster of feelings that are going together. That's another one that I already did a video on. And with that one, right, it's important for us to be able to recognize suffering in others when we see it and to connect with that. So all of these are really useful. Another feeling that I've been hearing about is frustration. Frustration with people who feel that others are not taking this seriously enough. Frustration with people who feel others are taking this too seriously and that it's disrupting their lives, right? There's going to be frustration, and we'll talk more about that specifically in another video about how to validate that feeling, what it's there for. But the important thing to know is that all of these emotions are natural in a situation like this. They all make sense. They're all coming up for a reason. And some of them are guiding us to take helpful actions. Some of them are just bringing us information, but they all serve a purpose. So one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is just touching on the topic of how to validate an emotion and what that means. So if you've been in therapy before, you are a therapist, or if you've been in the mental health realm at all, you probably heard the word validate, right? Is validating somebody's feelings. And validating is essentially the opposite of dismissing or minimizing or defending, right? So validate essentially means we take something and we say, yeah, that makes sense. And it doesn't mean that's right or that's the only way. Validating just means that's a valid response. That makes sense given the context. So with emotions, that's really important because we have a tendency to really criticize what we feel, because that's a lot of our experience just in general, is people not agreeing with what we feel or people feeling differently. And so it's really important when you're feeling any kind of emotion to stop and try and figure out, why does it make sense that I'm feeling this way? But in order to do that, you have to have an understanding of, in my mind, kind of some of the situations where those feelings are natural, they're normal, they're supposed to come up, so that you can come up with a validation for yourself. So an example of that might be, I'm feeling sad or lost this week, while because I've had to give up my usual routine of going into the office, seeing my clients face to face, getting to connect with them in that way. And it's been out of my ideal to meet with people over the phone or over video. And that makes sense. That's a loss. So being able to just recognize when emotions are valid, being able to talk yourself through why it makes sense that those feelings are coming up for you. So one of the other things that we're going to talk about is just how emotions influence our perspectives. So one of the things about emotions is that when you're in an emotional state, it really shapes what I like to think of as kind of the lens that you're looking at the world through. So an example of that might be if you're feeling anxious, right? If you're feeling uncertain, if you're feeling on edge, if you're feeling worried, all of these different kind of flavors of the same feeling. It's kind of like putting on a pair of glasses that makes you look at the world through a lens of what if. And all of a sudden, everything that you're looking at becomes a what if, right? In the same way as if you put on a pair of red glasses, right? Everything you look at is now going to be rose tinted, right? So recognizing that your emotional state is going to change your perspective on the world, right? Another example, right? You've experienced this if you've ever woken up on the wrong side of the bed, right? So if you wake up irritable, you wake up frustrated or annoyed, and you have the same morning that you always have, right? And maybe there's nothing really particularly out of the ordinary, but because you woke up feeling frustrated, right? From the second you open your eyes, maybe even before you open your eyes, you were annoyed. It's like putting on a pair of frustration glasses, like putting on a pair of anger glasses, right? And that creates a lens that helps us to perceive threats, right? Because that's what anger is for, right? On a functional level, anger is the emotion that helps us to perceive threats and to deal with them. And if you wake up on the wrong side of the bed already feeling a little angry, you're going to notice that all of a sudden everything is a threat, right? That question about where are my socks, like the question of when are you leaving for work, all of these things become threats, right? Even the other traffic on the road on your way to work becomes a threat, right? Everything becomes a threat. So it's important just to recognize that your emotional state will start to shift how you're looking at the world, the things that you're noticing, how you're interpreting things, the kinds of thoughts that are coming to mind about things. And I want to talk a little bit about why that happens and why that's important. So a lot of times when we kind of put on those emotional glasses, so to speak, whatever feelings that we're having in the moment, whether it's anger or anxiety or sadness, it serves a function, right? So if we're in a situation where the emotion is helpful to us, it's a primary emotion, it serves a really useful function, then the lens that we're looking through often creates drastic thoughts that help to enhance the painful signals that are coming with that feeling so that we pay attention to it. So let me explain that a little bit of a different way. If you lose somebody that you love, right, then sadness is a natural, functional response to that, right? But one of the things, if you've ever lost a loved one, like I have, you know that in that moment, your thoughts, right, so those lenses that you put on of loss, they start to create really extreme thoughts. I'm never going to love anyone else like that. I'm never going to feel that way about someone else again. I will never be happy again. I will never feel normal again. And these are really drastic thoughts, but they help us to connect with our sadness, right? And that's part of what makes us cry, right? So that we can release those feelings. Because if we were able to lose someone that we love, for example, and our thoughts were not drastic, right? So let's say, same situation, loss, but if your thoughts are things like, I'll be all right, or it's probably fine, right? You're not going to be able to access that feeling that helps you to grieve the loss, right? That helps you to move through those feelings. And the same thing with anger, right? So if we need anger in order to set boundaries and set limits with people in our relationships and to stand up for ourselves when we're being hurt and protect ourselves. And if someone is mistreating me in some way and my thoughts are things like, you can't do that, my needs matter, I'm important, right? Or I won't allow that. Then I'm going to feel really driven to say something and to stand up for myself, right? To set boundaries with them or to set limits. And if my thoughts are more kind of, if they're like, well, you probably didn't mean it, or I'm sure everything's fine, then I'm maybe not going to take a helpful action in that moment, right? So the emotion really helps us to the emotion helps us to kind of start seeing the world through this emotional lens, which intensifies the feeling and helps us to take some sort of functional action in situations where that emotion is helpful. The other thing, right, is that can hinder us in everyday life, right? So if you're having an emotion in a situation where it's not useful, then you might find yourself having drastic thoughts that aren't necessarily helpful. So it's important to know that this is a little bit different, right? Because the situation that we're in right now, a lot of these feelings are really valid and really useful if we're able to tap into them in the right ways. One of the things is this is an unpopular opinion, right? Because a lot of times in our culture, we especially try and stay away from any sort of unpleasant emotions. But these emotions are really useful to us in times of crisis. So there's a lot of importance around just emotional awareness. We live in a culture that tries to suppress any feelings that aren't pretty for us to watch, or that if you're experiencing them and I'm witnessing it, if I feel uncomfortable, or that are really painful for us to experience for ourselves. And ultimately that involves really anything that's not gratitude, joy, happiness, peace. Like it essentially takes out like 90% of our emotional toolbox, by stifling any of those emotions that we construe as like uncomfortable or negative. And so I want to kind of touch on that because there's going to be a lot of feelings coming up around this that aren't pretty. And they're really important, right? Because if we can't access our sadness, then we can't work through the losses that we're about to have. If we can't sit with our uncertainty, we can't make plans for how to stock up or how to plan for finances or how to arrange things in order to continue our survival. If we can't sit with our anger, then we can't recognize when someone is doing something that isn't the right fit for me or conflicts with my values and the way I want to live. And those are all really crucial right now. One of the things that I notice the most often with my clients, with myself, with people in my life, is that whenever we have these really negative emotions that we consider to be like the bad ones, is the urge to avoid it, the urge to stuff it down, to put it away. We have a lot of shame and anxiety around feeling bad, right? So we feel bad about feeling bad. And in a moment like this, right, a lot of times if you have that urge to avoid, it means that if you're feeling bad, you're going to do whatever you can to get away from those feelings. So you might notice that if you are kind of falling into this trap of feeling bad about feeling bad, you might find yourself doing a lot of things trying to get away from the feelings that are coming up for you right now. So you might notice yourself drinking more. You might notice yourself eating constantly. You might notice yourself falling into season after season of Netflix, right? Like anything to distract yourself. And it's not to say that any of those things in moderation is inherently bad. It's not. But if you are having the urge to avoid and to shut off your feelings, you might notice yourself doing some of these things in order to get away from the feelings, simply because you're not sure what to do with them, right? But one of the things that, I try and caution my clients about, and I've seen it in my own life, is that avoiding or distracting yourself from your feelings in a constant way. And I don't mean sit with your feelings all day long, 24/7. Nobody has time for that. Nobody has the energy for that. But if the distraction and the avoidance is 24/7 and there isn't any space where you are really allowing yourself to sit down and kind of suss out, like, what am I feeling? What can I do with this? What it does is it creates an emotional backlog. So it basically just stuffs all of those feelings in and they get stored until things are calmer and then they come back out. So they kind of come back to haunt you, so to speak. In my mind, it is way more emotionally efficient to just deal with them while they're here, now. The other thing that I notice happens a lot when we are distracting ourselves or we're trying to push away any of those feelings is that we miss opportunities to take helpful actions. So one of the things that I mean by helpful actions might be coming up with plans, right? Like, because if you're not sitting with your uncertainty, then you're not coming up with plans right now. And plans are really useful. Right now is the opportunity for when you can be coming up with preparations for yourself or figuring out different ways to avoid things that you're kind of seeing on the horizon. The other thing is that by allowing yourself to actually have that emotion, have it come up, sit with it, label it, figure out what it is. It's not just stress or I feel bad. A lot of times we use these umbrella terms of like, I'm upset, I'm stressed, I feel bad. And that's kind of like if you went to a doctor and you said, I'm sick, and they said, okay. And that was as far as the conversation went, right? We have to know, well, what's happening? What kind? Can you label it? Can you identify what's going on with you, right? Because it's far more useful to say, I'm really sad right now. There's so many things that I'm losing right now, and to give yourself permission for that, because that becomes an actionable step, right? Something that you can do, as opposed to, I feel bad, but not really knowing what kind, just bad. The other thing, right, is that by actually going toward these feelings and allowing themselves to come up, whether that means allowing yourself to sit down and to worry and to write out lists and to make plans and preparations, or allowing yourself to cry, allowing yourself to feel these feelings actually gives you the opportunity to process them and to let them up and out, which means that you store less of them in your body, which means they don't come back to haunt you later, or less so. So that's just a little bit about emotional processing and some of the things about why this is so important, to not stuff these feelings in and to really take some time to sit and look at them, and see what kind of helpful actions you might be able to take. So the next video is coming soon. I hope you guys find this helpful. If there's other topics that you want to know about, feel free to post them in the comments.